He was once the embodiment of Renaissance vigor, a golden-haired prince who jousted, danced, hunted, and ruled with charm that rivaled the sun. Henry VIII was more than a king. He was a towering force in 16th century Europe. But by the end of his life, that image had curdled. The robust monarch had become a bloated, ulcerous, paranoid tyrant who could barely stand, let alone command the realm he had so passionately reshaped. His courtiers whisper behind heavy velvet drapes. His physicians recoil from his oozing wounds. And the once feared king found himself imprisoned in a failing body and a darker mind. This is the beginning of the end for Henry Tudor, a man who broke from Rome, beheaded wives, and founded a dynasty through blood and fire. But now, we peel back the curtain on his twilight years, when power clung to him like a shadow, and death came not swiftly but slowly, rotting him from within. By the late 1540s, King Henry VIII was no longer the dashing ruler who had once been hailed as England's Hercules. His waist had swollen beyond 50 inches, and his once proud frame could scarcely support his own weight. The man who had written poetry, composed music, and led charges in battle now required mechanical devices just to be moved from room to room. A hoist had been installed to lift his massive body onto his horse, a symbol not just of physical decline, but a kingdom burdened by the weight of its sovereign. Court painters still portrayed him in all his regal finery, broad-shouldered and commanding. But these were illusions, carefully curated lies painted in oil and gilded in flattery. Behind closed doors, the truth was harder to mask. The stench of decay followed the king like a specter. His leg, once injured in a jousting accident, festered with ulcers so deep and infected that pus would seep through his wrappings, soaking into his clothes and bedding. Some said you could smell Henry before you saw him. Others claimed his screams of pain echoed through the stone halls of Whitehall like a dying animal's. His physical suffering was only half the story. With each year, Henry became more irritable, volatile, and suspicious. Trusted advisors found themselves dismissed, imprisoned, or worse. The same king who once confidently navigated diplomatic circles was now gripped by paranoia. He accused former friends of betrayal and saw enemies lurking in every corner of his court. Some historians speculate he suffered from complications of untreated diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or even syphilis. But no diagnosis could fully capture the darkness that settled over Henry's mind. What made this descent all the more tragic was the haunting contrast. In his youth, Henry VIII was widely adored, athletic, articulate, and magnetic. He was not born to be king. That role was meant for his older brother, Arthur, who died young. When Henry inherited the crown at 17, England saw a second chance for greatness. His early reign was full of promise. He patronized the arts, debated theology, and walked among his people. He was seen as the ideal Renaissance monarch, England's golden boy. But somewhere along the path of broken marriages, broken alliances, and broken faiths, Henry himself began to break. Power, once used to serve a vision, began to serve only his desires. He created the Church of England not for spiritual reform, but to annul a marriage. He dissolved monasteries and seized church wealth. He executed Thomas More, beheaded in Bullen, and ordered the deaths of countless others, all under the guise of royal duty. By his final decade, Henry VIII was a shell of the man he once was, both feared and pitied, obeyed and avoided. His royal chambers became prisons of stinking sheets and whispered secrets. He trusted few, lashed out often, and retreated into solitude, surrounded by sycophants who dared not speak the truth of his condition. And still, the crown weighed heavy upon his brow. In the chapters to come, we'll dissect the causes of his decay, from the infected wound that refused to heal, to the lavish feasts that fed his growing girth, to the delusions that clouded his once brilliant mind. Henry VIII's death was not sudden. It was a slow erosion, a collapse of flesh and will. And it is in that collapse that we begin to understand not only the man, but the monster he became. Before we delve further into the torments of Henry VIII's final years, we must first remember who he once was. Not the wheezing tyrant swaddled in bandages and silks, but a blazing monarch who once best strode the stage of Europe like a colossus. To fully grasp the tragedy of his end, we must measure the height from which he fell. In his youth, Henry VIII was a king of almost mythic proportions. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-chested and athletic. By all accounts, He was extraordinarily handsome, fair skin with auburn hair and radiant blue eyes. His presence was magnetic. Foreign ambassadors described him as the most impressive prince in Christendom, a man of immense charisma and physical vigor. But Henry was not only a sight to behold. He was a force of nature. He hunted tirelessly, sometimes for hours or even days. He jousted with knights, often unseating them with skill and power. He was a master archer, a tennis player, and an accomplished dancer. He rode fast, lived loudly, and dined as though he had the appetite of 10 men. This was no fragile monarch. Henry VIII lived as though death were a distant, forgotten thing, something that need not concern a king so seemingly invincible. But underneath the armor, silk, and confidence, there was a fragile thread, one that would begin to fray long before the rot ever set in. In 1525, during a jousting match, one of his favorite pastimes, Henry suffered a leg injury. It seemed at first to be a relatively minor blow, but in truth, it was the first crack in the armor. That injury would never fully heal. It would swell, fester, reopen, and become infected time and again over the decades. In his later years, it transformed into an ulcerous wound that refused treatment and oozed putrid fluid. His physicians attempted all they could with the primitive medicine of the time, cauterization, poultices, and drainage, but nothing worked. The leg became a symbol of his bodily decay, a festering insult to his once glorious vitality. But for many years after the injury, Henry refused to slow down. He continued to hunt, to feast, and to rule with the bold confidence of a man untouched by fear. Yet the toll on his body was accumulating. As he aged, he became heavier, more prone to fatigue. His once chiseled figure ballooned. At the peak of his youth, Henry weighed around 180 pounds, lean for his towering frame. But by his 50s, he tipped the scales at over 300 pounds. The agile stallion of his youth had become a wheezing beast of burden. It was not merely gluttony that transformed him, though that played its part, but the growing limitations imposed by pain and disability. As his leg deteriorated, he moved less. As he moved less, he gained weight. As he gained weight, his health worsened further. The king who once danced all night now needed help mounting stairs. His attendants used padded chairs with wheels, a crude precursor to a wheelchair, to move him around the palace. And as the body weakened, so did the mind. Henry began to lash out more frequently. His temper, always sharp, became volcanic. His decisions were increasingly erratic. Loyal servants were discarded on suspicion alone. Former friends became enemies overnight. He accused his wives of betrayal, often with fatal consequences. Some scholars now believe Henry may have suffered from traumatic brain injury. In 1536, he was unhorsed during another jousting tournament and lay unconscious for 2 hours. It's possible this incident permanently altered his personality, intensifying paranoia, impulsiveness, and cruelty. From there, the decline quickened. His former wife, Catherine of Aragon, had died, and Boleyn was executed. Jane Seymour died giving birth. Anne of Cleves was divorced. Catherine Howard, young and vibrant, was also executed. By the time he married his final queen, Catherine Parr, Henry was no longer a fiery king chasing love and glory. He was a battered relic trying to cling to control of his court, his image, and his decaying flesh. There is perhaps no clearer example of this transformation than Henry's armor. Early in his reign, he wore slim, mobile suits designed for speed and style. But in the last decade of his life, his armor was reinforced, wide, and purely ceremonial. One suit built for him measured 54 inches at the waist. It wasn't meant for battle. It was meant for show, a desperate lion made of iron. The young lion had become a rotting lion, roaring not with strength but with fear. In this tragic arc from vigor to vulnerability, we see the seed of Henry's undoing. For a man who believed so fiercely in divine right and personal power, losing command over his own body was an unbearable betrayal. He could execute a wife, destroy a monastery, or silence a courtier, but he could not silence a leg that throbbed each night with agony. He could not cut away the swelling, nor banish the smell that seeped through his chambers. And so, Henry VIII, England's once greatest king, began his final transformation. not into legend, but into a cautionary tale. By the time the 1540s drew to a close, Henry VIII's body had become both battlefield and prisoner. The once mighty sovereign who had bestridden the fields of sport and war was now locked inside a cage of flesh, corrupted, swollen, and bleeding from within. This was no ordinary aging. It was grotesque, degrading, a slow march toward death that betrayed the image he so carefully projected. And as his condition worsened, so too did the silence of his court. For no one dared speak aloud what was now clear to anyone who entered the room. The king was rotting alive. The human body has limits, even for a king. Henry VIII pushed his own for decades. By his early 50s, those limits had collapsed. He weighed well over 300 pounds, possibly as much as 340. His frame, once tall and broad, now buckled under the sheer mass of his own flesh. His chest heaved with labor breath. His legs were thick and discolored. And most infamously, his left leg, the source of so much torment, had become a grotesque wound that refused to heal. This leg ulcer, chronic and festering, had begun with that fateful jousting injury years before. But over time, the damage had gone far beyond the surface. The wound would swell with fluid, then burst, releasing pus that soaked to the linen wrappings and stained the floors and furniture of his chambers. The smell was intolerable. Courtiers and physicians often had to suppress their gag reflexes just to perform their duties. Even ambassadors noted the putrefaction that surrounded the monarch. Imagine the most powerful man in England, surrounded not by glory or honor, but by the stench of his own decaying flesh. The wound was not just a source of pain, it was a source of shame. Henry forbade open discussion of his condition. He insisted he was strong, capable, divine. But his silence did nothing to stop the rot. Infection was a constant danger. Gangrene, a very real threat. And without the benefit of antibiotics or antiseptic practices, the odds of recovery were nearly non-existent. Leeches were applied. Poultices packed into the leg. Surgeons attempted to drain the fluid with knives. But nothing worked for long. The ulcer may have been the most visible symbol of his decay, but it wasn't the only one. Henry suffered from chronic constipation, likely caused by a sedentary lifestyle, poor diet, and metabolic issues. His abdomen swelled with trapped waste. Hemorrhoids plagued him. His skin grew sallow and discolored, especially around the eyes and lower limbs. He suffered from migraines, insomnia, and spells of confusion. Some days he barely moved from bed. Other days his temper flared with frightening intensity, likely fueled by pain and sleeplessness. And yet his appetite remained monstrous. Henry continued to feast on rich meats, cheeses, and pastries. He consumed enormous quantities of wine and ale. His meals could stretch for hours. His chefs prepared extravagant banquets, more to please the ego of the king than to nourish him. No one dared tell him no. And so he fed the very illness that consumed him. His mobility became increasingly limited. He needed special braces to stand and mechanical hoists to lift him from bed to chair. He rarely walked unaided. Some reports suggest he wore padded clothing not just to support his girth, but to cover bed sores and lesions that had begun to form from too much time in one position. His body, once the source of his pride, was now a source of isolation. The public, however, saw very little of this. When he appeared in portraits or processions, it was with careful curation. Artists painted him tall, broad, and commanding. Tailors stitched garments that had swelling and discoloration. Ceremonial armor was built to exaggerate his girth as a symbol of power, not weakness. These images remain today, powerful, unyielding, false. The reality was much harder to look at. And yet, despite it all, Henry clung to his identity. He remained the supreme head of the Church of England. He continued to rule, issue decrees, and play kingmaker. But it was all built on a crumbling foundation. The man who had divorced Rome, defied the Pope, and shattered centuries of tradition, now struggled to climb a staircase. Each breath was a battle, each movement a torment. In many ways, Henry's physical decline mirrored the political and spiritual instability he had unleashed. His body was breaking, just as the nation still reeled from the aftermath of the Reformation. The monasteries were gone. The court was divided. His children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, Each represented different visions for England's future. But the present was dominated by a king who could no longer lead from the front. He ruled now from a chair, behind thick curtains, surrounded by whispers. This is the moment in history when the illusion truly begins to break, not with a public collapse or a dramatic betrayal, but with the quiet, relentless destruction of the king's body. It was not war that brought Henry to his knees. It was a slow, terrible betrayal of his own flesh. And in the next chapter, we explore the very wound that started it all, the leg injury that refused to die, and in doing so, took the king with it. In the annals of royal suffering, no tale is quite as visceral, or as symbolic, as that of Henry VIII's leg wound. What began as a simple injury on the jousting field transformed, over time, into a festering curse. A wound that never healed. A wound that never let him forget his fragility. A wound that, in many ways, became his legacy. To understand the magnitude of this wound, we must revisit the scene of its origin, a moment that changed everything. It was January 24th, 1536. Henry VIII, then in his mid-40s, was still a powerful and imposing figure. But during a jousting tournament at Greenwich, disaster struck. In a dramatic and violent fall, his horse, fully armored, toppled onto him. The king was unhorsed and crushed beneath the metal beast, suffering a severe blow to his leg and, as many historians now believe, a possible traumatic brain injury. He was unconscious for 2 hours. Courtiers reportedly feared he would not wake at all. Queen Anne Boleyn, pregnant at the time, was so distraught she reportedly miscarried shortly afterward, possibly due to the stress of believing her husband was dead. When Henry finally awoke, he was badly bruised, with a deep gash in his left leg. At first, it seemed survivable, but over time, the wound refused to close. It became inflamed, then infected. What followed was a decades-long battle with a single part of his body, a war that his surgeons could never win. The ulcer formed deep in the flesh of the thigh and calf. It would periodically swell and burst, oozing pus and blood. The smell, according to reports, was overwhelming. At court, it was described in whispers as a malignant sore, a putrefying fistula, and a plague unto itself. Physicians of the day did what they could, but their tools were crude, their understanding of infection limited, and their loyalty to the king more rooted in fear than medical honesty. They tried leeches to draw out bad blood, cauterization to burn away the rot, poultices made from honey, herbs, and animal fat to fight the smell. None of it worked. And perhaps most cruel of all, none of it reduced the pain. Henry suffered intensely. Each dressing change was an ordeal. His leg would throb for hours. Sleep was difficult. Even sitting upright for too long caused agony. He took to wearing stiff, padded stockings to minimize irritation. His clothing was carefully arranged to hide discoloration and seepage. But he could not hide the truth from those closest to him. Servants had to clean the pus-soaked linens daily. Special chairs were designed to accommodate the leg without pressure. The king who once stormed into battle could now barely walk across a room. Worse still, the wound altered Henry's behavior. Pain became a constant companion, and with it came rage, impatience, and suspicion. His famous temper grew more explosive. Loyal advisors were dismissed or executed with increasing frequency. Even those who had served him for decades learned to tread carefully, lest a bad day with the ulcer translate into a fatal decision from the throne. Some historians argue that this shift in personality, from Renaissance prince to paranoid despot, was deeply tied to the psychological toll of chronic pain. Imagine, for a moment, being the most powerful man in England and knowing that no one could fix the one thing destroying you from the inside. But the ulcer was more than just a medical issue. It became a symbol of Henry's mortality, of divine punishment, even of poetic justice. To his enemies, it was proof that the king was cursed for his sins, especially the execution of his wives and the break from the Roman Catholic Church. To his courtiers, it was a reminder that proximity to the king was both an honor and a risk. Few who served him long were spared his wrath or his decline. The wound also isolated him. Increasingly, Henry withdrew from public appearances. When he did emerge, it was in controlled settings, carefully managed. His portraits never showed the bandages, the crutches, the pain. Artists continued to depict him as broad, upright, and imposing, a lie inked in paint. But those who visited his court knew better. They saw the king limp. They heard the moans at night. They smelled the rot in the halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court. And perhaps the most damning truth of all, it was his pride that kept the ulcer alive. Henry refused amputation. Physicians may have quietly suggested it, but no one dared press the issue. Had the leg been removed, the king might have survived longer, but such a procedure was nearly always fatal in those days due to shock or infection. Henry would not risk his image, nor the risk of dying on a surgeon's table. And so the wound remained, unhealed, unspeakable, and ever-present. In the coming years, the ulcer would continue to rob him of mobility, dignity, and peace. It would inflame his temper, cloud his judgment, and isolate him further from the world he once ruled with vigor. But Henry still had his throne, and his power, and as long as he breathed, no matter how ragged or pain-filled, he would remain king. Yet all who saw him knew the wound was winning. Next, we'll explore what happened behind the curtain, how the king's physicians and inner circle coped with the monarch's decline, and how their silence may have hastened his end. Power isolates. And for King Henry VIII, isolation became a daily reality, not just from his people, but from the truth. In the final years of his reign, as his body failed and the pain grew unbearable, he became increasingly reliant on a tight, secretive inner circle. Doctors, servants, advisors, they were the ones closest to him. They saw his bloated limbs, the putrefying wound, the erratic moods. They heard his groans in the night, and yet they said nothing. Why? Because telling the truth could cost you your head. At the center of this web of silence were Henry's royal physicians. In Tudor England, these men weren't just doctors. They were political figures, handpicked for loyalty, discretion, and often flattery. They knew the king's physical and mental decline better than anyone. And yet, they walked a dangerous line. Say too little, and you failed your duty. Say too much, and you might be accused of treason. Henry employed several physicians in rotation, many of whom held impressive academic credentials. They came from England, Italy, and even Spain. They had access to the best medical knowledge of the time, though that knowledge, by today's standards, was rudimentary at best. Bloodletting, herbal poultices, leech therapy. They could relieve some symptoms but rarely cure. One of the key men in this circle was Dr. William Butts, a trusted royal physician who remained close to Henry through much of his reign. He, along with others, helped manage the king's deteriorating condition, especially the infamous leg wound. Reports suggest the physicians tried every known treatment available, cleansing the sore with wine and vinegar, packing it with linen soaked in balsam and resin, applying mustard plasters to draw out infection. But the wound kept coming back, more virulent each time. And yet, the king would hear no talk of failure, no suggestion of amputation, no whisper of mortality. Physicians learned to speak carefully. They would assure him of progress, no matter how fleeting. They dared not speak the full truth. The wound was killing him, slowly, from the inside out. The courtiers, too, were caught in this cruel masquerade. These were the nobles, secretaries, and attendants who served in the royal apartments. They saw the swelling. They smelled the putrefaction. They watched Henry's personality shift, from confident and commanding to paranoid and volatile. But they also knew their king, and they knew how quickly he'd turn on those who displeased him. A single misplaced comment, a stray look of pity or disgust, could mean exile or worse. So they smiled. They bowed. They assured the king of his strength even as he had to be lifted into bed with a pulley system. They repeated the lies so often it became truth within the palace walls. The king was not dying. He was merely ill, temporarily unwell, recovering soon. Behind closed doors, of course, the silence fractured. Some wrote letters, coded, cautious, hinting at the truth. Foreign ambassadors observed the king's appearance and behavior with growing alarm. Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, remarked in letters that Henry was old, immobile, and burdened with great pain, though even he treaded lightly in his reports. In court, appearance was everything. The body could rot, but the image had to remain intact. Perhaps the saddest victims of this deception were Henry's own children. Prince Edward, the heir, was too young to fully understand his father's condition. Mary and Elizabeth, children from previous marriages, were allowed only limited contact with their ailing father. What they saw was tightly controlled. He might appear for a brief meal or a private conversation, heavily perfumed and carefully dressed. But the long days of suffering, the screams from his chambers at night, those remained hidden. This web of secrecy wasn't just about protecting Henry's ego. It was also about protecting the kingdom. England had no stable succession plan. The realm had been rocked by religious upheaval, executions, and wars. If word spread that the king was no longer fit to rule, it could spark rebellion. Foreign enemies would see opportunity. Domestic factions would jostle for power. The stability of the realm rested on a lie, that the king was still in control. So, the physicians stitched smiles onto their faces. The courtiers whispered only when the doors were shut tight. The servants scrubbed the floors clean of blood and pus before the sun rose. It was theater, played every day in the gilded halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court. A royal performance in which the lead actor was dying behind the curtain. But even behind the mass of power, there were cracks. The king grew increasingly mistrustful. He lashed out at old allies. His eyes, once sharp with command, were often dull, sunken, confused. Some days he forgot names. Other days he flew into uncontrollable rages. He shuffled papers around, demanded audiences with ghosts of past advisors. He signed decrees with trembling hands. Still, no one dared confront him directly. His signature still held legal power. His voice still commanded armies. And so the court waited and watched and lied until the very end. Henry's condition was a state secret, but secrets cannot be buried forever. And in the next segment, we'll see how Henry, despite his decay and delusions, tried to orchestrate his final legacy through wills, power plays, and a desperate hope that his name would outlast his body. As death loomed closer, King Henry VIII did what kings often do in the final act of their lives. He sought to shape what came after. He knew his body was failing. He knew his ulcerous leg, his erratic moods, his weight, and his whispers of delusion had all become too great to ignore. But if he could no longer command the present, perhaps he could control the future. And so began Henry's final gambit. A meticulous, ruthless attempt to script his legacy, even as he rotted in his bed. To understand the depth of this final maneuver, one must understand Henry's obsession with legacy. This was, after all, a king who had broken with the Catholic Church just to ensure he could produce a male heir, a man who had 6 wives, 2 of them beheaded, in pursuit of dynastic permanence, a monarch who redefined English sovereignty around himself, and now faced the chilling reality that his time was nearly done. In the winter of 1546, Henry's physical decline became impossible to hide. His movements were minimal. He remained largely confined to his bedchambers at Whitehall Palace, attended by a small army of servants, physicians, and trusted courtiers. The smell of rotting flesh, his ulcerated leg, lingered through the corridors. So, too, did the weight of uncertainty. England had no precedent for a smooth royal succession after such chaos. His only male heir, Prince Edward, was still just 9 years old, intelligent, but delicate and frequently ill. Henry knew that if he died without a strong plan in place, Edward's reign could dissolve into factional war. And so, he summoned his advisors, lawyers, and clerks, not to confess, not to reflect, but to dictate. Henry's last will and testament was not a gentle farewell. It was a document of power, control, and paranoia. In it, he named Edward as his successor, with a carefully curated group of 16 men to serve as a regency council until the boy came of age. Each of these men had been tested, watched, and, in some cases, blackmailed into loyalty. Henry did not trust anyone fully, but he trusted the thread of his legacy. He also laid out an order of succession that included his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, but only after Edward, and only if he had no heirs. This was a remarkable shift. Both girls had previously been declared illegitimate, Mary as the child of the discarded Catherine of Aragon, Elizabeth as the daughter of the executed and Boleyn. Including them now was strategic, not sentimental. Henry was sealing the Tudor line against chaos. But the will went even further. It tried to control the marriages of his children, the religion of the kingdom, the inheritance of his lands. He dictated everything, down to the style of his tomb, a grand marble monument to be erected at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, decorated with golden effigies of angels, prophets, and himself. Ironically, the tomb was never built. The funds were redirected, the plans discarded. In death as in life, Henry's vision exceeded his grasp. As the king's health plummeted, so too did his awareness of his vulnerability. He had ceased to attend council meetings. His appetite had dwindled. He struggled with fever, swelling, and confusion. Yet despite it all, he refused to acknowledge the end. When asked directly if he wished the last rites, the sacrament for the dying, Henry remained silent. Only when his confidant Sir Anthony Denny pressed again did the king finally nod, acknowledging what everyone around him had feared to say aloud, that he was dying. But even in these last hours, the secrecy continued. His death would be kept quiet for days to ensure a controlled transition. The court could not afford panic. The common people could not yet know. So, while Henry lay gasping, barely conscious, the gears of state turned in silence. On January 28, 1547, sometime before dawn, King Henry VIII breathed his last. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand speech, no final moment of redemption or repentance. Just the last breath of a man who had ruled England for nearly 4 decades, who had reshaped a kingdom in his image, and died trying to control what came after. His body, grossly swollen and stinking of decay, was sealed in a lead-lined coffin. The journey to Windsor would take many days. During the procession, legend says that the coffin began to leak, the rot within too powerful to contain. His death was announced days later. Bells rang across London. Mourning began, and the Tudor court entered a new era under a child king, Edward VI, guided by men chosen by a father too afraid to leave anything to chance. But as history would soon show, legacy is never fully in one's control. Henry's careful plans unraveled in time. His heirs battled. His religion fractured. His tomb remained unfinished. And yet his name endured. The man who died stinking of rot, bloated with regret and ambition, would live on in memory, in myth, in power. For better or worse, Henry VIII's final gambit ensured that even in death, he would never be forgotten. Next, we'll follow Henry's corpse to its final resting place and explore the eerie rumors, the leaking coffin, and the chilling words said to have foretold his end. On the morning of January 28, 1547, the breath left King Henry VIII's body. The man who had once ruled England with unmatched confidence and iron-fisted authority now lay swollen, silent, and decomposing in his royal bed at Whitehall. But his death, like everything else in his life, was not simple. It was not immediate. And above all, it was not yet public. For 2 days, the court kept silent. His body remained in his chambers while his closest advisors worked feverishly to secure the future he had outlined in his will. Every word of that document was treated as gospel, but they all knew something else, something unspoken. The moment word spread that Henry was dead, the balance of power would shift. Nobles would rise. Ambitions would awaken. Enemies, both foreign and domestic, would pounce. So, the king's death was cloaked in secrecy. When the announcement finally came, it was delivered with the gravity of a religious event. Bells tolled across London. Black drapery was hung from palace walls. Priests offered prayers for the soul of England's most infamous king. And preparations began for the most elaborate funeral England had ever seen. Or so it was planned. Henry's body was embalmed and placed in a lead-lined coffin. His sheer size, coupled with the decay already eating through his flesh, made the process a challenge. His doctors and embalmers struggled to slow the decomposition, packing his body with aromatic substances, herbs, spices, wax, and linen. But it was already too late. The rot had set in. When the coffin was sealed, it was moved, first to St. James's Palace, where a vigil was held. Nobles took turns standing guard over the body. A wax effigy of the king, dressed in royal robes and holding the orb and scepter, was placed above the coffin. It was a chilling vision of a monarch now more symbol than man. Then came the journey to Windsor, a multi-day funeral procession through the bitter English winter. The coffin was carried in a massive carriage drawn by black caparison horses. Nobles rode beside it. Thousands gathered in the streets to watch in hushed awe. Trumpets blared. Monks chanted. Black flags whipped in the wind. But as the procession crawled along the countryside, a foul stench began to rise. The lead coffin, despite its sealing, had begun to leak. The rot of Henry's corpse could no longer be contained. Body fluid seeped from the casket, staining the linens and wood beneath. At one stop along the route, likely at Sion Abbey, attendants reportedly discovered a trail of liquid and the unmistakable odor of death. The story goes that dog licked at the floor beneath the coffin. Whether this tale is true or embellished, it quickly took on a life of its own. To many, it seemed a fitting punishment for a king so obsessed with flesh, food, lust, power, now being devoured by it. Even more unsettling was a prophecy that had long haunted Henry's conscience. The fiery reformer and Protestant martyr, John of Gaunt, once preached that a king who defied God, who cast aside the Pope, dissolved monasteries, and soaked his reign in blood, would die like a beast, and that dogs would lick his blood as a sign of divine justice. The leaking coffin, the smell, the stains, it all seemed to some as if the prophecy had come true. Eventually, the bloated body of Henry VIII reached its final resting place, St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. He was laid to rest beside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the only wife to bear him a son, and the only one he claimed to have truly loved. And yet in death, even his tomb betrayed him. Henry had commissioned an elaborate monument during his life, one that would rival those of ancient emperors, a marble structure gilded in gold, with angels, lions, and a towering effigy of the king himself. But after his death, funds were diverted, the plans were forgotten, and the tomb was never completed. Instead, Henry was buried in a vault beneath the floor. No grand sculpture, no towering monument, just a flat stone, worn smooth over time, bearing only a small inscription added much later. Visitors today walk over it unaware. It is a strangely humble end for a man who once believed the world should kneel before him. But perhaps that, too, is part of his legacy. A reminder that all power fades, that even the mightiest kings rot, that even the most iron-willed rulers are ultimately silenced, not by their enemies, but by time and by death. Henry VIII's funeral may have tried to glorify his reign, but the leaking coffin, the unmarked tomb, and the absence of grandeur all whisper a quieter truth, one no funeral could hide. That kings die like men, and some, like Henry, decay more loudly than others. In the next segment, we'll turn from death to myth and explore how Henry VIII's reputation survived, twisted, and grew into one of the most unforgettable legacies in royal history. In the final days of January 1547, the body of Henry VIII was lowered into the vault at St. George's Chapel. His coffin, swollen, leaking, and silent, disappeared beneath the cold flagstones of Windsor. But the man himself, the legend of Henry, never truly died. In fact, in some ways, he was just getting started. What happens to a monarch who defies the Pope, beheads 2 wives, reshapes a nation's faith, and leaves behind a string of broken alliances, orphaned legacies, and blood-soaked policies? He becomes myth. He becomes a shadow that lingers. In the centuries that followed, Henry VIII was reborn, not in flesh, but in narrative. He became the caricature of tyranny, the icon of Renaissance masculinity, the symbol of unchecked royal power. He was painted in oil, sculpted in marble, written into plays, whispered in ghost stories, and reborn again and again on screen. But the truth, the raw, difficult truth, is far more complicated than the myth. To some, Henry VIII was a visionary, a political genius who dared to free England from the suffocating grip of Rome, a ruler who created a centralized monarchy, strengthened naval power, and ushered in the English Reformation. In this light, he was bold, shrewd, even necessary, a man of iron will, bending history to suit his vision. To others, he was a monster, a gluttonous despot, driven by ego and lust, who destroyed lives and families in pursuit of control. A man who executed close friends and advisors without remorse, who left the nation's finances in tatters, who married 6 times, discarding women like pawns on a chessboard. So which version is real? The answer is both, and neither. History's gaze is never still. In Henry's own lifetime, he was praised as defender of the faith, then reviled as a heretic. In Elizabethan times, he was seen as a necessary but dangerous predecessor. In the Victorian era, he was condemned as morally repugnant. In the 20th century, filmmakers and novelists reimagined him as a tragic antihero or lustful brute. Each age saw in Henry what it wanted to see, a mirror of its own fears, fascinations, and ideals. One thing, however, remained constant: Henry's ability to command attention. Unlike many monarchs whose stories fade into dusty pages, Henry VIII continues to provoke. We cannot look away from him, even as he disgusts us. Why? Because Henry VIII represents the ultimate contradiction. He was a king who feared death, yet hastened the death of others. A man obsessed with legacy, who undermined his own dynasty. A ruler who craved love, yet destroyed the women who gave it. He built and broke with equal fury. His reign was a storm, and England would never be the same again. And so, historians are left to untangle his knots. Some praise his establishment of royal supremacy, the idea that the king, not the pope, held spiritual authority in England. That shift laid the groundwork for the modern British state. Others mourn the dissolution of the monasteries, a cultural catastrophe that saw centuries of art, books, and tradition lost forever. Thousands were displaced. Abbeys were looted. The spiritual fabric of the country was torn apart in the name of reform and royal coffers. Sound, echoing footsteps, fading chants. Even his court became a study in contradictions. It produced some of the finest minds and most celebrated figures of the English Renaissance: Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Hans Holbein, and Bullen, and then devoured many of them in its hunger for obedience. In the modern world, Henry's story is retold endlessly in films, TV shows, historical novels, documentaries, sometimes as satire, sometimes as seduction. But beneath every dramatization, the core remains the same: power taken to its extreme. He is a warning and a fascination, and his body, decomposing beneath Windsor, has become a metaphor for his reign. Grand, grotesque, unforgettable. Perhaps the most revealing detail of all is that Henry VIII never got his tomb. For a king who shaped history with such force, his grave is surprisingly modest. Beneath the chapel floor, in an unadorned vault, lies the body of a man who believed he was chosen by God, but who was, in the end, claimed by rot, regret, and the slow unraveling of his own plans. But that's the thing about Henry VIII. Even in death, he refused to disappear. He lingers in textbooks, in scandals, in the question every historian must ask: was he the king England needed, or the king it had to survive? In our next segment, we return to the beginning, tracing the rise of young Henry, full of promise and potential, and how the seeds of greatness became the roots of ruin. Before there were the bloated, paranoid king of history's dark whispers, there was a young Henry VIII, a prince full of promise, vitality, and hope, a man who stood on the cusp of greatness, whose future seemed limitless. But somewhere along the way, the golden prince who first ascended the throne transformed into the tyrant who would define an era of English history. Born in 1491, Henry Tudor was not supposed to be king. He was the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And when he came into the world, the crown was destined for his older brother, Arthur. Arthur's untimely death in 1502, however, catapulted the 10-year-old Henry into a role he was never meant to play. But what a prince he was! From his earliest years, Henry exhibited all the traits that would later make him both beloved and feared: a sharp intellect, an athletic frame, a love of music and the arts. He was well educated, fluent in languages, and passionately devoted to the Catholic Church. Henry, at the time, was everything a prince should be: handsome, capable, and full of promise. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1509, his brother's widow, seemed like a union of destiny. It strengthened England's ties with Spain, a rising power in Europe, and was initially a symbol of diplomacy, respect, and loyalty. The young couple was said to be deeply in love, and for a time, Henry seemed like the very image of the Renaissance monarch, cultured, wise, and determined to lead his country to greatness. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The first cracks came in the form of Henry's growing dissatisfaction with his marriage. Catherine failed to provide him with a male heir, a constant and overwhelming obsession for the king. And with each failed pregnancy, Henry's frustration grew. The once passionate love between the king and queen became strained, the foundation of the marriage crumbling under the weight of royal expectations. It was during this tumultuous period that Henry's hunger for power and for a dynasty that would outlast him began to show its true colors. He sought solace in the company of women, and his attention soon turned to Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, whose beauty, wit, and ambition captivated the king. The desire for a male heir, one that Catherine could no longer give him, grew into a desperation that would eventually lead Henry to break from the Catholic Church. In 1534, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, thereby severing ties with Rome and setting the stage for one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, the English Reformation. This was the moment Henry began to shed his princely image and become the king we now recognize in the history books. The tyrant, the king willing to kill for power. In his quest to secure his dynasty, Henry didn't hesitate to execute his wives, annul his marriages, or disband monasteries that had stood for centuries. And most chillingly, he executed friends and advisors who had once been loyal to him, all in the name of control. And Boleyn's execution in 1536 marked a turning point. Once the woman who had ignited Henry's greatest passion, she was now the woman whose death would come to symbolize his capacity for cruelty. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges many historians now regard as politically motivated. Her death sent shockwaves through the court, and her fall from grace seemed a stark reflection of Henry's own transformation from a young, vibrant prince into a ruthless and paranoid monarch. The break from Rome also had far-reaching consequences. It was more than a religious divide. It was an assertion of royal supremacy over the divine, a dangerous precedent. In the process, Henry not only tore apart his own marriage, but fractured the religious unity of England, leading to religious warfare that would scar the country for generations. The once promising king had become a man capable of shocking violence. The people began to whisper his tyranny, his erratic moods, his lavish spending, and the increasingly savage act of vengeance he enacted against those who oppose him. The crown was no longer the symbol of a kingdom united in faith and order. It had become a symbol of instability and fear. Henry's later years, the years of his physical decay, mirrored his internal rot. His body, bloated and disfigured, seemed a reflection of his soul. The man who had once been the picture of health, energy, and grace was now confined to his bed, unable to move without the assistance of others, consumed by his gluttony and self-indulgence. And yet, even in his decline, Henry held on to his power. He had become a man who ruled through terror, a monarch who surrounded himself with sycophants and enemies alike, ready to dispose of anyone who did not serve his ever-shifting whims. The tragedy of Henry VIII is not that he was born to be a tyrant, but that he allowed his insecurities, desires, and obsessions to shape him into one. He was a victim of his own ambition, a king who believed that greatness could be achieved through control, only to discover that power does not last, and no king, no matter how mighty, can escape the ravages of time. And so, in the end, we are left with a legacy that is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but a complex, tragic tapestry of a king whose transformation from golden prince to tyrant is a lesson in the dangers of unchecked power and the cost of an insatiable need for control. In the next segment, we will trace the aftermath of Henry's death, how his son, Edward VI, inherited a nation on the brink of ruin, and the struggles that followed. On January 28th, 1547, Henry VIII passed on the world he had so violently shaped, leaving behind a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. The world had witnessed his brutal rise to power, his terrifying reign, and his eventual painful decline. But his death was not the end of the turmoil. In fact, it was just the beginning. The throne passed, as Henry had decreed in his will, to his young son, Edward VI. At the time of his father's death, Edward was just 9 years old. His reign would last only 6 short years, but those years would be marked by instability, religious turmoil, and the unfinished work of the king who had once ruled with such brutal ambition. Edward was Henry's only legitimate male heir, the product of his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour. Henry had hoped that Edward's birth would secure the Tudor dynasty. But what it failed to anticipate was the fragility of both his son's health and the kingdom he was leaving behind. Edward's reign was under control of regents, primarily his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, who acted as Lord Protector. The young king's health was frail, and his reign was shaped by the ambitions of those who sought to control him. The most notable of these was the Protestant faction that had gained prominence during Henry's reign, following the king's break with Rome and his establishment of the Church of England. Henry VIII had been many things, but one thing he had never fully embraced was the full breadth of Protestant reform. He had created the Church of England, but it was still, in many ways, a Catholic church with the king at its head. His death left a void that would be filled by those pushing for more radical reform. Edward VI's reign was marked by sweeping Protestant reforms. Under the leadership of the regents, laws were passed that stripped away Catholic practices. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, replacing the Latin Mass with an English service, and a series of laws were enacted that pushed England further into the Protestant fold. This era saw the destruction of more monasteries, the removal of traditional Catholic icons, and the promotion of a more radical form of Protestantism. For many, the death of Henry VIII marked the true beginning of the English Reformation, though it would be a journey fraught with conflict. The changes made under Edward VI would set the stage for further religious upheaval after his untimely death in 1553. But for now, under Edward, the Protestant vision was firmly in place. But this religious shift wasn't the only legacy Henry left behind. The nation that Henry had once dominated was now a fractured one. Henry's incessant wars with France and Scotland had drained the royal treasury. His lavish spending on palaces, military campaigns, and his court left England financially strained. The vast wealth he had acquired through the dissolution of monasteries had been depleted by extravagant wars and reckless spending on his personal pleasures. Henry's court was a shadow of its former self. Under his rule, it had been the center of culture, art, and learning. But after his death, many of his former allies and courtiers fell out of favor. The kingdom was governed by those who saw it as a prize to be fought over, and England's political landscape shifted rapidly as factions vied for control. The monarchy itself was shaken. Henry had built an empire, but it was fragile, built more on his personal power and than on the institutions he had created. With his death, the Tudor dynasty was left vulnerable to challenges, both external and internal. Henry's legacy, though full of grandeur and ambition, left England with a kingdom far from stable. His son, Edward VI, never had the strength to consolidate the changes his father had set in motion. Edward died young, a boy king whose death in 1553 brought another shock to the kingdom. But it was his sister, Mary I, who would inherit the crown next, and she would attempt to undo much of what Henry had set into motion. In a brief but intense reign, she would try to restore Catholicism to England, an effort that would only increase the divisions that Henry had left in his wake. Even as England moved past the age of Henry VIII, the echoes of his reign continued to shape the monarchy for years to come. His children, despite their youth and fragility, would carve their own marks on history. Mary, the Catholic queen who would burn heretics. Elizabeth, the Protestant queen who would lead England to greatness. But all of them were shaped by the father they never knew, and the kingdom he had left behind. And so, Henry VIII's final act, his painful death and the disintegration of his physical form, became the symbol of his rule. His body, decaying in his grave, mirrored the fractured kingdom he left behind. His story, one of ambition, destruction, and stubbornness, continued to reverberate through history. His legacy was one of extremes, the genius of his political reforms and the madness of his tyrannical behavior. In the end, he left behind a kingdom on the verge of collapse, a kingdom that would be rebuilt only through the blood, struggle, and genius of his descendants. Henry VIII, the rotten king, was gone, but his kingdom and the myths that surrounded his reign would endure. This brings us to the end of our story. But as with all legends, the questions remain. What might have been if Henry had made different choices? If his ambition had not led him down such a brutal path? The answers, like the man himself, are lost to history, rotting like his body beneath the stones of Windsor, yet still haunting the corridors of time. Join us in uncovering the haunting final days of Henry VIII. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more gripping historical stories. Share your thoughts on the downfall of the king in the comments below.